But let's see. So we have Michael. Michael is asking how to automatize taxonomies. I guess like how to build some automations around it. Is it possible? Like, do you do it at work with some sort of automation?
Yeah, so there are some automation types you can think of. It's usually pretty complicated and it requires a lot of setup. So for something more simple, for a simple project, I probably wouldn't think about automation. But there are some ideas like at Udemy, what we do is we actually have instructors tag their own courses. And so when they don't find a tag from our existing taxonomy that works for them, they can actually suggest a tag. And what I get to see over time is the accumulation of those suggested tags. And then we can decide, okay, should we add that as a tag or not? So that's a version of automation. It might be more of a crowdsourcing, but it does free up the taxonomist team from individually looking at what tags should I create, right? Like it creates a signal for demand and it allows us to focus and prioritize where it might make sense. There are other automation ways of getting new input for your taxonomy, but usually it's hard to start from scratch from an automated source. If you have a lot of content and you have some machine learning intelligence on your team, you could look at clustering to kind of inform some logical groupings within your content. And that can kind of give you some sense of like, okay, it seems like I have a lot of content in this area and that area, and then you can think about the tags you might want to develop. Usually the clustering doesn't create the tags for you though, right? It just kind of gives you some peek into patterns that occur in your content.
That is super helpful. How do you think about useful terms when the content is highly dynamic or evolving? That was chatting.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a big challenge. I think we struggle with that too. Language actually changes more than you think, especially in some spaces, right? So like in tech, new technologies are coming up all the time. And so we have to stay on top of those. Even new careers, right? Like there are new careers that didn't exist 5 years ago that we suddenly need to understand and add to our system. So it can be very dynamic. But there's still going to be some sort of threshold that you set, and you kind of have to design that for yourself, whatever makes sense. Like, okay, you know, a really basic rule of thumb is like, if there's 3 pieces of content that could use this tag, then maybe go ahead and create that tag. But that number might change depending on how much content you have or how many tags you have or what your users need. So yeah, in a dynamic space, it can change a lot, but as long as you create your own criteria for what useful means to you, either based on how many pieces of content or maybe some other user demand signal, you can kind of keep yourself straight and focus where it matters.
Excellent. So we have a question here. It's 2 questions, but I think they are almost the same. So Mariana and Grace, they are asking about how to align the vocabulary that you use in branding and how the company talks about itself, and then the internal language. So how do you manage those two? Do you drive your taxonomy based on what people are going to be searching for only, or you kind of include internal language as well?
Yeah, so great question, because usually different sets of people use different terms depending on who they're talking to or what content they're organizing. So it goes back to what your repository needs to focus on. If it needs to speak to everyone inside the company and it needs to use the same labels for that, you might want to create an understanding inside your organization that's shared across all teams, and that you can use for your labels. But if everyone's it's kind of like that marketing and product example I shared. If everyone's kind of aligned and kind of understands what marketing uses and they use it for their own stuff, then that's kind of best case scenario from the taxonomist point of view. So you're like, great, everyone's aligned on the same vocabulary, and you can just go ahead with that. Some taxonomy teams will also map internal vocabularies to kind of provide more of an enterprise view. That's a whole area of expertise in taxonomy land, because there is value in getting the enterprise across the board speaking the same language. And so sometimes that can come up in something like a research repository because you are speaking to different stakeholders. And so there could be a role for the researcher to try to align where it makes sense.
Wonderful. So Clara is asking, what is the best way to start? For example, did you start with types of products or the research method? With the premise that the people that are going to be searching this research data is within the organization. So how you get started?
Yeah, great question. So I would start with whatever you get asked most frequently. So based on what, so make your life easier, right? Like, you know what people ask for you. And so what would make your life easier in finding and quickly retrieving that content and getting it to the person who's asking? So pay attention to the requests that are coming in, and that will give you insight into where to prioritize your tags. And it's probably not like, oh, I'm going to have one category like products fully fleshed out. I would more imagine it to be, what are your top 3 categories, and what are like the top 3 tags you need within those? And then maybe that's where you start, right? You can always add new categories as you think about them, or as it kind of becomes a bigger need. You can also add more tags to each category, but you're probably going to want to start with a couple different filter types with different tags underneath, rather than one filter that's really fleshed out. It's probably going to be a little less useful.
Perfect. So Michael is asking, what are the common mistakes or errors? Like, how do you know what are the gotchas? You know, the gotchas in the taxonomy.
Yeah. So I think sometimes where we get tripped up as taxonomists is overcomplicating. So when we think about edge cases, and there's always edge cases, well, some of the difficulty comes from figuring out when to kind of punt on an edge case and say, okay, that's truly an edge case. I'm not going to design for that right now. We'll see if it becomes bigger in the future. I think that's where we kind of get into trouble, is when we try to design for every possible scenario. You really have to be strict with yourself, especially at the beginning, right? And be like, okay, I'm going to focus on this chunk, and I'm going to do this really well. And hopefully that aligns with the questions that you get asked most frequently, the content that you have most of, and it'll satisfy the majority use cases. And then from there, you can decide, okay, do I have time to dip into these edge cases? Because I get the impression this is no one's full-time job, right? Everyone here is doing this on top of their already full-time research job. So cut yourself some slack, make it as easy as possible for you. Start simple, start with the biggest areas of opportunity.
Perfect. So April is asking if you have any tips on governance, like how do you manage that?
Yes. Oh, what a wonderful question. I love this question. So I'm a huge fan of documentation. And as taxonomists, we get in the business of documenting a lot so that things are made explicit and can be carried on over time. So we think about documentation for governance in terms of what we meant by the tag and how it should be used if there's any sort of ambiguity, any sort of governance around when to add a new tag. So like thinking about the criteria, okay, what do I think is enough content to warrant a new tag? Documenting that can help manage a taxonomy over time and make sure that those decisions are made consistently, even if you're not the only person making those decisions, right? And then also can help you explain your design choices to stakeholders when they don't see something or they have questions. You're like, well, we actually have standards for this and it's documented over here. So yeah, documentation can be really important. I wouldn't, for this kind of thing, I wouldn't stress out too much about it, because documentation is one of those things that you can definitely spend a lot of time on if you let yourself. And it should be lightweight. It should just document, the high level decisions that you made in terms of designing your taxonomy that are important for the next time someone needs to make an update to the taxonomy.
There you go. There's always this need of like, how can we evolve this in a way that's manageable, that we can continue making it successful and so on. So that is a very important point. This is interesting. John is asking your thoughts about tagging things with sentiment positive or negative. Like when you have this type of dimensions, If you're doing analysis, for example, and it's not only for searching, you know, is that good or bad? Is it too black and white to say something is positive and negative? I don't know.
I don't know. So that's the kind of thing. Yeah, no, it's great because that's the kind of thing that really goes back to what your content needs and what your users need, right? So the fact that taxonomies are tailored to the content itself really means that I can't give one answer, right? It's really going to be that consultant speak of it depends. I could definitely see that being really useful in a lot of cases, especially if you're sorting through a lot of content that's coming in through, you know, the sales team or customer success, right? Like, and feeding that to maybe product for new areas of research. So yeah, I could definitely see that being really useful. There are tools I know for sales and customer success that will help with that kind of sentiment tagging that you could then pull in maybe as like a new filter. Or, you know, there are lots of different ways of providing solutions for that. And I think that's definitely it's definitely very interesting, but I can't give you a black and white answer like yes, no. It really depends on what your users expect and how you think you could make that content useful.
Absolutely. So Caroline is asking how to make sure that the tag other or random does not transform in trash.
Yeah, well, so it kind of a little bit does though, right? Like it's okay if there's like a lot of random stuff that collects there because that's the purpose. It's better that it collects there than it gunks up another tag that actually has meaning behind it, right? So you want the other tag to collect all the stuff that doesn't fit very well other places because otherwise what's going to happen? You're going to get like irrelevant stuff tagged with search, or irrelevant stuff tagged with another tag that actually means something concrete, and then you're going to pollute the results for that tag. So it's okay if random stuff collects in other. I would just say maybe create a rule for yourself where you only use it when you can't use a different tag. So don't use it with another tag from the same category because then it's not being useful. But that's the only way I could see it going really crazy.
Got it. So Annette is asking, but she's saying that based on guidance from somebody else that was in her job before or has done this before in her company, she's been creating a taxonomy by analyzing raw notes from complete studies. And she's asking, what are your thoughts on how to start from scratch?
Oof, that's a hard one. Anytime you're like working with raw text to develop tags, you could do something like a frequency count on words or phrases. That can sometimes help to see, okay, just to like sort out a bunch of words that are not going to be used a lot. If you have, I would do that if you really have no tags. The other thing you could look at is your content structured at all? Are there like titles or headings or certain intro paragraphs that you know might be more useful for gleaning terms that you could use as tags, so that just to kind of limit what you can look at, because you know you're human and you don't have oodles of time. So I would look at things like that, like is the content structured in such a way that I can ignore certain parts and prioritize looking at really information-rich sources? If not, then maybe looking at term frequency to kind of get a glimpse into how frequent certain things are spoken about in your content, and that could inform some good tags that you might want to create. But that's a tough one. Dealing with raw text is really tough.
Indeed. So Charan is asking, I'm curious about the easier to split than merge. This seems counterintuitive. Wouldn't it be really simple to search, for example, an esoteric tag and replace it with a more generic merge tag versus having to actually laboriously go through individual old content to add a new split tag? I hope you understood that one.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think I keep repeating myself. It depends. But so when I say it's easier to split than merge, it's because when you're dealing with legacy data and someone has already used your data in a certain way, and then you change that by merging two concepts that used to be separate, it might cause problems for them. So if they're used to retrieving their content in one way and only getting a small subset of your content, and then you merge two concepts, you're fundamentally changing the results that they used to rely on. So that's why I say it's harder, because it's always easier adding something new and saying, hey, I created something new and you can now pick this up in this way and it's going to be useful to you. It's a little bit easier for downstream products to leverage new concepts than it is to manage changes within the concepts. That's getting into like the technical part of taxonomy work, but it is something to think about if you have a lot of people relying on your tags and thinking about like whether it's easier to split or merge. It's definitely easier to create a new concept than it is to change an existing one for downstream products. But you may not have downstream products, in which case you can go wild.
Okay. So I'm trying to compile a couple of the questions that seem to be in the same area. What are the resources that you recommend for people to read, books, courses, any material that might help them to further their understanding of taxonomies?
Yeah, there is a book out there that's meant for people who are just practitioners and just want a practical introduction. It's called The Accidental Taxonomist, and it's written by Heather Hedden. If you really want a book on taxonomy work, that will explain a lot of the different concepts we talked about today, like how do you disambiguate terms, what makes a good synonym, that kind of thing. And otherwise, you know, I don't have any like key resources for you, but I think there's like a lot of good documentation like for the tool that you use. So I know, Sophia, you have put together a lot of documentation for metadata in Enjoy HQ, for example. And I think the demos will also help with this kind of question too. Yeah, it's more like finding the practical resources that are going to fit you. Or you can read about generic taxonomy work if you're really interested in more like how do you decide what makes a synonym and what makes a good label for a term. Geek out with me by reading The Accidental Taxonomist.
That's a great book. I haven't read it, but I heard about it so many times. It's really, really good. So I'm going to take one more question because we have a couple of taxonomies that we want to have a look at. And then, sorry, Jesus. So Eloise is going to be replying to the rest of the questions. I'm going to get those questions after the event and send it to her so she can reply to some of those, the ones that we missed. There's a lot of them. So they're not going to be unanswered. I promise we'll go back to you. But let's go with the last one from Alex. He says, do you have any recommendation for creating tags related to problem spaces, solution, as opposed to specific product research initiative? I guess that has to do with whether I'm doing research right now and I'm classifying data for my own understanding versus I already have data that people are going to be searching. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. So it's harder and easier when you're just making tags for yourself and your own analysis, right? Because I find when I do this kind of thing, it changes a lot because as I go into my analysis, I discover, oh, maybe I want another tag, or oh, maybe that one doesn't actually fit. So if you want to use tags for your own analysis, just be patient with yourself and expect it to change and evolve more and more rapidly. But that's okay because it's probably just for you. So you have a lot more flexibility. And then if you want to think about the different problem spaces, yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really great way to think about useful tags for yourself. I think the challenge there would just be, developing the ones that make sense to you and your product and your problem spaces. And then maybe thinking about reaching out to some stakeholders, kind of double check, like, oh, hey, like if I made these tags, would that also work? Like, do you also think about this in the same way? And that can kind of help you think about new tags and validate whether you have good tags. You probably have good tags for your own work, but I could see a scenario where you might eventually want to use your tags just for the internal analysis. You might want to promote them to actually be user-facing tags for the research itself eventually. So if you think that might be the potential, then it's always good to kind of like get a second pair of eyes and maybe do a little bit of a brainstorm with someone else. But yeah, I love that idea.
So that was the last question. Again, we will reply to the rest offline, but let's talk about, or let's actually look at a couple of taxonomies, the several teams design. So